In this lesson, you'll work with the options in the Web category of your project's properties. To begin, open the Joe's Bar Web Application project from your Sample Files folder. Now view the properties of the project if they're not visible already. To do this, right-click on Joe's Bar Web Application in the Solution Explorer and click Properties. Now you're going to examine the properties in the Web tab. Click Web on the left. The web options for your project appear. First, we're going to look at the Start Action settings. Try setting the start page of your project to default.aspx. To do this, right-click on default.aspx in the Solution Explorer and click Set as Start Page. Although the start page has been changed, it isn't immediately reflected in the web options. Close the Project Properties window by clicking the X next to its name. Now reopen the Properties window by right-clicking Joe's Bar Web Application and clicking Properties. You can now see that default.aspx is the start page. This means that default.aspx will always be opened first when you run your project in debug mode. Set the start action back to the default setting of Current Page now. Visual Studio will now display whichever file is currently open whenever you start your project in debug mode. This is the default and is usually the preferred way of working. The other start action options are rarely used. Start External Program allows you to start an entirely different program when you start debugging. The virtual web server will still start, but no pages will be displayed. Start URL allows you to open an entirely different website when you start debugging. This is sometimes used to test web services. Don't open a page simply starts the virtual web server without taking any other action. Next, take a look at the options in the Servers group. The Servers options control the virtual web server that Visual Studio uses when you debug a project. By default, Visual Studio 2012 uses the new IIS Express virtual web server for debugging. Visual Studio 2010 used the Visual Studio Development Server option. IIS Express offers more customization than the older Visual Studio Development Server system, but both options are identical for most purposes. You should usually leave this setting at the default. Finally, you're going to change the virtual path that is used by the virtual web server. Start debugging now by clicking Debug, Start Debugging, and examine the path in the address bar of your browser. The address is http://localhost followed by a number. The number indicates the port. Ports can be thought of as channels for web traffic. Some ports are reserved for specific purposes. For example, port 25 is used for email traffic. Web pages are usually sent through port 80. If you set the project URL to localhost without specifying a port, it would default to port 80. Visual Studio assigns a random port to the virtual web server. This allows the virtual web server to run more than one web application at the same time by assigning them to different ports. Close your web browser now and return to Visual Studio. Now click in the Project URL box and add the text joesbar/. Now start debugging again. Click Yes when prompted. And notice that the home page is now shown in a Joe's Bar folder. This is a useful simulation of hosting the site in a subfolder of a domain. For example, learnasp4.com/Joe's Bar. This is very useful if your application is going to be hosted in a subfolder, as it allows you to simulate the live environment. Hosting in a subfolder can cause problems, particularly when working with files. By setting the Project URL option correctly, you can ensure that you catch these problems before publishing your site to the web. Close your web browser now and close Visual Studio. You've now completed Lesson 1.6. Change Web Options.